Remember to support the Purity Heroes campaign by Purity Coffee. Purity Coffee is matching first-time orders and donating to nurses, doctors, and EMTs on the front lines of the COVID crisis. Healthcare workers also receive 30% off at puritycoffee.com. The Purity Heroes campaign, supporting our frontline healthcare workers fighting against COVID. Make sure to use promo code PODCAST for 10% off your first subscription. puritycoffee.com. Hello, podcast listeners and coffee drinkers from around the world. You are now listening to the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. I'm your host, Jordan River, and I want to thank you for tuning in today. Before we get started, please tell a friend about the Coffee, Health, and Science podcast. Share the show with a coffee lover, with a peer, with a colleague. We do appreciate it. Make sure you give the show a good rating and review. It helps move us up in the charts, and it helps grow the show more than you might think. Today's episode is the second installment of our Coffee History series. In case you didn't catch the first episode of Coffee History, where we discussed both the discovery of coffee in Ethiopia and the incredible journey it took across the Atlantic to the Americas sometime later, be sure to go back and give that episode a listen. But today's show is a very interesting one. We are going to explore 4 times throughout human history when coffee was either demonized or outright criminalized. And there really is a wide range of reasoning behind the animosity. It ranges from religious beliefs to wild claims about the dangers of coffee consumption to even one king who simply claimed beer was superior to coffee in every way. We are going to go through our list in chronological order with a bit of an introduction first. So without further ado, let's explore together 4 times when coffee was demonized or criminalized. When it comes to coffee criminalization, I wanted to start at the beginning with a bit of an honorable mention. You see, the 4 time periods on our list that we will be exploring today all revolve around kings and leaders criminalizing coffee to keep coffee away, to keep coffee out of the hands of their citizens. But this first tale revolves around keeping coffee in the hands of the people. You see, legend has it that coffee was discovered in Ethiopia by a fateful goat herder named Kaldi. If you listened to the first episode of Coffee History, you learned that, according to legend, Kaldi discovered the properties of raw coffee cherries, but it wasn't until they were passed on to a monk that coffee was actually roasted and brewed into the beverage that we know today. Supposedly, that first monk was a Yemenese Sufi, an Islamic holy person, and supposedly, the Yemenese people were the first people to truly understand the entire process of growing, roasting, and brewing drinkable coffee. As it turns out, people loved the coffee, of course, and the Yemenese merchants quickly realized the value of maintaining a stranglehold over this rare and delicious beverage. In order to maintain their monopoly, they made certain, under penalty of death, that no plants or viable seeds left the country. Well, eventually that all changed when in the year 1616, a Dutch East India Company merchant stole a couple of plants as he was leaving Yemen. These plants would provide the lineage for the coffee that was eventually brought to Java by the Dutch, allowing for the global spread of the coffee phenomenon. As you will see today in our exploration, as the warm tide of coffee crashed onto the shores of the wide array of wildly different societies, they all reacted in vastly different and fascinating ways. So now that we've got our introduction out of the way, let's begin our deep dive into the first instance of coffee being demonized. Let's you and I travel to the year 1600 AD, to the nations of Christendom. Coffee was still largely controlled by the nations of Islam, but it had spread via Islamic traders and had begun to enter Italy and Europe. Enough movement to catch the attention of the Catholic Church. Because of coffee's deep roots in Islamic culture, the Catholic clergy had long labeled coffee as the devil's brew, and at the very end of the 1500s, members of the church were urging Pope Clement VIII to place a ban on coffee, preventing it from infecting the nations of Christianity. They claimed that because Islam forbade the drinking of wine, which was central to Christian holy practices and ceremonies, they had developed coffee as their substitute to wine, which made it an unchristian, sacrilegious drink that shouldn't be allowed into Christendom, and they urged that its trade and consumption be forbidden outright. According to legend, though, Pope Clement did no such thing. Upon tasting coffee himself, he supposedly declared, quote, "This Satan's drink is so delicious that it would be a pity to let the infidels have exclusive use of it," end quote. He was also attributed as saying, quote, "We shall fool Satan by baptizing it and making it a truly Christian beverage," end quote. Pope Clement VIII went on to bless the coffee beans, allegedly due to his observations that coffee appeared to be better for the people than alcohol from a health perspective and a spiritual perspective. This blessing surely upset the anti-coffee contingent in the Vatican, but us coffee drinkers should be glad that Clement chose the course of action that he did. The blessing allowed coffee to be freely traded and consumed within Europe, solidifying its existence as a truly European beverage. I, for one, am very glad that the Catholic clergymen didn't get their way and fully criminalize this delicious drink. I'm not personally well read on the history of Pope Clement VIII, but I love the fact that even then, the holy man himself was wise enough to observe that coffee was a much healthier choice than the many alcoholic beverages that people would consume at the time, often with all 3 meals. And he acted on that belief and opened the floodgates for coffee into Europe. Just that fact alone makes me interested in him as a figure in history. Let's move on now to our second instance of coffee animosity. Fast forward a few decades to around the year 1623 and shift your focus this time to the grand city of Istanbul, occasionally renamed to Constantinople, the heart of the incredible Ottoman Empire. In the year 1622, the Ottoman nobilities and janissaries had Sultan Osman II assassinated, and after a brief regression to the previous king, eventually the way was paved for the new leader of the empire to be crowned, one Murad IV. Now, the thing is, you didn't want to be a coffee drinker in Murad IV's Istanbul, because you could quite literally lose your head over it. You see, Murad hated coffee. He believed drinking coffee was provoking social decay and promoting disunity in his capital city. Drinking coffee was considered a capital offense under Murad's rule. In Murad's Istanbul, religious leaders preached on street corners that coffee would inspire indecent behavior. As the bean moved west into Europe, physicians rallied against it, claiming that coffee would, quote, "dry up the cerebrospinal fluid," end quote, and cause paralysis. According to one story, an Ottoman Grand Vizier secretly visited a coffee house in Istanbul. He observed that the people drinking alcohol would just get drunk and sing and be jolly, whereas the people drinking coffee remained sober and plotted against the government. Coffee fueled dissent, and this is something you see not just in the Ottoman Empire, but all throughout history. I'd like to share with you a few paragraphs from an article I found on this subject on atlasobscura.com. It really does a great job of laying out coffeehouses' role in Ottoman society and how it differed from other gathering places like taverns. Quote, "More often, secular authorities opposed coffee for political reasons. Before coffeehouses, Zilfi points out, there weren't many spaces in the Ottoman Empire for people to gather, especially across social lines, and talk secular matters. Mosques offered a gathering place, but rarely accommodated long, worldly chit-chat. Taverns weren't good for Muslims, and patrons usually got ripped with people they knew, had fun, and passed out. Coffee houses, though, were considered acceptable for Muslims. They were cheap, and they lacked social restrictions, so they were accessible to everyone. The way they made coffee, slowly brewed in a special pot for almost 20 minutes, and then served in a cup filled to the brim, so bitter and scalding hot that it could only be consumed in tiny sips, encouraged patrons to sit, watch whatever entertainment came through, and talk. Coffee houses were a new social space that encouraged class mixing and energetic conversations about cities and governments." And guess what? Murad IV did not want you having conversations about his governments. The Sultan himself was so intent on eradicating coffee that he would supposedly disguise himself as a commoner and walk the streets of Istanbul with a 100-pound broadsword. The story goes that he would sneak up on unsuspecting coffee drinkers in disguise and decapitate them where they sat with one swift stroke of his giant sword. Luckily, Murad IV's successor was more lenient. The punishment for a first-time offense was a, quote, light cudgeling, end quote. Caught with coffee for a second time, the perpetrator was sewn into a leather bag and tossed into a river. Yikes. What's truly amazing, though, people still drank coffee. And you see this time and time again throughout history. The drink is so intertwined in our cultures that removing it by force never really seems to work out in the long run. The fact is, humans love coffee. They're going to drink it. And if you're someone who's in a position of power, it's probably best to just get used to that fact and let it be. Now let's go ahead and turn our attention to our third example of criminal coffee. And let me tell you, this one is truly extraordinary. The time is 1746. The place, Sweden. And this time, the coffee-hating ruler in question is Sweden's King Gustav III. Right off the bat, what I find interesting about this particular case is that Gustav wasn't resisting the introduction of coffee into his culture. In fact, Gustav III took the throne around 75 years after coffee had been thoroughly introduced to Swedish culture. But that didn't stop him from waging a war on coffee, this time not for religious purposes, or even out of fear of dissent. No, it seems that Gustav genuinely believed that coffee was horrible for the human body, even going so far as to label it a poison. Once Gustav III took the throne, he used his powers immediately to begin attacking coffee. In 1746, a royal edict was issued against coffee and tea due to, quote, the misuse and excesses of tea and coffee drinking, end quote. Heavy taxes were levied on consumption, and later, coffee was banned completely, and Swedish authorities were even reported as confiscating and destroying coffee paraphernalia. Imagine the sight of Swedish police smashing coffee cups and dishes on the street. As in all our examples today, despite the ban, coffee consumption continued. Now here's where the story gets really, really bizarre. Gustav wanted more than to just illegalize coffee. He wanted to prove that his beliefs about the incredible dangers of coffee were true, and he wanted to show the world just how unhealthy this beverage was. So King Gustav III of Sweden arranged for an official, royal experiment to be conducted to prove just how poisonous coffee is. The experiment consisted of taking two identical twins from a Swedish jail who were both set to be executed for murder and forcing them to drink excessive coffee and tea every day until it killed them. One prisoner was instructed to drink 3 pots of coffee a day, while the other twin was instructed to drink 3 pots of tea per day. King Gustav must have honestly believed his own anti-coffee rhetoric because he fully expected the twins to quickly fall ill from overconsumption and eventually die, proving once and for all that coffee and tea are in fact horribly unhealthy. Well, as it turns out, fate and history carry with them quite a bit of irony, because the twins didn't fall ill and die, and unfortunately for Gustav III, he was actually shot and killed during a masquerade in 1792, long before either the tea drinker or the coffee drinker died. The story gets even more bizarre as it turns out that the people who were in charge of conducting the experiment died as well, leaving the tea and coffee drinking murderers to continue their over-caffeination by themselves. And in case you're wondering, the tea drinker lived to be 83 years old before finally succumbing to the poison drink, and according to legend, the coffee drinker outlived him to an unknown age. This is rather hilarious if you look back on this knowing what we now know about coffee and longevity, especially seeing as how these prisoners lived well into their 80s in a time before modern medicine, basically doing nothing but consuming antioxidant-rich beverages every day. Nice try, Gustav, but I don't think the experiment went down quite the way that you expected it to. All right, what a wild one that was. Let's wrap it up now with our final example of coffee demonization. And it brings us to the great nation of Prussia in the year 1777. King Frederick II, or Frederick the Great, has ruled Prussia for nearly 40 years. On September 13th, 1777, Frederick the Great issued an official royal proclamation decrying coffee consumption and proclaiming beer to be the superior beverage. In it, he wrote, quote, "It is disgusting to notice the increase in the quantity of coffee used by my subjects, and the amount of money that goes out of the country in consequence. Everybody is drinking coffee. If possible, this must be prevented. My people must drink beer. His Majesty was brought up on beer, and so were his ancestors and his officers. Many battles have been fought and won by soldiers nourished on beer, and the king does not believe that coffee-drinking soldiers can be depended on to endure hardship or to beat his enemies in case of the occurrence of another war." End quote. And if I may go one step further in painting Frederick as our story's antagonist, it has been said that, despite his proclamations, Frederick himself drank copious amounts of coffee. So once again, we come to this issue of motive. Why would Frederick be so afraid of coffee in Prussia? I'd like to quote another article, this time from mentalfloss.com, and it really lays out the subject well and explains Frederick's reasoning. Quote, "For one, Frederick was terrified that excessive imports could ruin his kingdom's economy, and he much preferred to restrict commerce than to engage in trade. Since coffee, unlike beer, was brought in from across the border, Frederick regularly griped that at least 700,000 thaler leave the country annually just for coffee, money he believed that could be funneled into well-taxed Prussian businesses instead." End quote. Quote, "To redirect the people's spending patterns, Frederick ordered a number of steep restrictions, demanding that coffee roasters obtain a license from the government. This sounds like a reasonable regulation until you learn that Frederick summarily rejected nearly all of the applications, granting exceptions only to the people who were already cozy with his court. Frederick was adamant about keeping coffee out of the hands and mouths of poor people, writing, quote, 'This foreign product has extended into the lowest classes of human society and caused great contraband activities,' end quote. To stop them, he hired approximately 400 disabled soldiers to work as coffee spies, or sniffers, to roam city streets, quote, 'following the smell of roasting coffee whenever detected, in order to seek out those who might be found without roasting permits,' end quote. That is absolutely wild. And of course, as in all other cases, these restrictions eventually failed. More and more coffee smugglers and illegal roasters sprung up, and people continued to consume until eventually Frederick the Great died and his anti-coffee legislation was lifted. I found it particularly hilarious that Frederick argued the health benefits of beer over coffee, and I'd like to end this segment with a quote from a letter Frederick the Great wrote to Robert Liberalus, excuse the pronunciation there, a scholar of German Jewish history. Quote, "It is despicable to see how extensive the consumption of coffee is. If this is limited a bit, people will have to get used to beer again. His Royal Majesty was raised eating beer soup, so these people can also be brought up nurtured with beer soup. This is much healthier than coffee." End quote. I hope you enjoyed today's installment of Coffee History. I know I sure enjoyed producing it. I look forward to bringing you more entertaining and educational content around coffee and health, as well as more coffee history in the future. This is Jordan Rivers signing off, wishing you an extraordinary day. We'll see you next time on the Coffee, Health, and Science Podcast.